Hey, what's going on, folks? It's Mike here, and welcome to the next lesson in our D programming language series. In this lesson, we're going to be talking about visibility attributes. So those of you with C++ or Java experience, for instance, are used to public, protected, and private visibility attributes. And these are ways to encapsulate or hide data. And generally speaking, this is a tool for us as programmers to make sure that we don't mess up the internal state of something when we're doing object-oriented programming or working with structs. So I'm going to go ahead and show you an example here with structs, and then we'll revisit this later with modules and classes in the D programming language. But let's go ahead and get an introduction and look at the D programming language website here to get started. So I'm going to go ahead here, and from documentation, let's go ahead and go to the language reference, and I'm going to go down here to attributes. And you're going to see we have all sorts of attributes. In fact, some things that we've already talked about before, things like immutable, for instance, are an example of attributes, or const. But we have here this category here, visibility attribute, which is what we're going to be looking at today. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Now, immediately, here's our list of visibility attributes. And again, if you're coming from a C family language, maybe something even like C# or Java, for instance, you're probably used to public, protected, and private here. But you'll notice in D, we have export, package, as well as visibility attributes. And for those, I've got to talk about modules a little bit, so make sure you subscribe to this series, and we'll get to those later and talk about how they might be useful for us when it comes to visibility. But of course, you can read on these if you want. But let's just go ahead and start with some of the basics here with public and private here, and talk about some of the things that are a little bit different in the D programming language and just start to demonstrate how we can use these. So with that said here, let's go ahead and scroll down here and see what private means. And we're going to see this in the context of a struct as well. So private basically means we can only access data from within the same module. Now, for us, for most of this series, we've been looking at just one single source file. That's sort of one module itself, main.d, for instance, or the main module. But later on, when we define different modules, this will become important. Or for example, if you're using a library, sometimes you don't want the visibility and everything. You just want the interface for how you're using something. So as a library writer or somebody building some software for some of the system, you often want to mark things as private. This also has some implications, again, when we talk about classes, which will be for later, about your ability to, or your lack of ability to, override a particular function, for instance, when you're using inheritance. Now, protected only applies for classes, so I'm going to skip this as well, but similarly, it hides different fields or functions at the class level, for instance, where this will be more relevant, or even the module level. So the thing that I have to talk about here as well with private, protected, and public is that this applies at a module level. And I'll give you an example of that as well. So these are some things that are going to be new with the D language, but I think they're well thought out and useful. And public attribute here. And this is the default visibility attribute here. So whether for structs or classes or modules themselves, for instance, we have public. So again, we'll get to this when it comes to modules and so on, and I'll just show you a little bit of a brief example. But anyways, with that said, let's go ahead and look at these visibility attributes here. I'll leave them on the side so we don't forget about them. And we'll talk about private, protected, and public here. Now let's just go ahead and do an example here. And basically I want to show you how we've been writing our code thus far in the D programming language. So let's go ahead and just do something like this. And let's go ahead and create a new struct, which is what I'm primarily going to be talking about. And I like to use usually as an example, say a student struct here. And let's just give some fields like the name and an ID, for instance, here. Okay, so something reasonable like that. And just as an example here, let's just go ahead and create some student here, S. And let's go ahead and do Mike, and we can give it an ID, 1, 2, 3, 4. Something like that looks reasonable to me. Let's just go ahead and write out our student here. And we'll go ahead and make sure I didn't make any silly mistakes. So that looks pretty good to me here. Now, the issue here with this is one of two things. One, we're going to want to likely, at the very least, start splitting up our code into different files. Now, again, what the rules are and so on are going to actually follow your company's guidelines, or maybe guidelines that you come up with for your hobby projects. But it makes sense to start splitting up files here, meaning that, well, maybe I should have a file here called student that has the struct student and all the related information with it. Okay, just so our files become a manageable size. Although on a side note, I do know files that sometimes get 20,000 lines long. Again, it just depends on what kind of project you're working on. But the issue here is, well, what if I don't want someone to actually have access to, say, this ID field? Meaning that as it stands now, I can actually do s.id and maybe set it to 0 or something illegal like that. Okay, so this internal data or this field or member variable here that's part of student here, I want to encapsulate or protect so that I as a programmer don't make this silly mistake here of just accessing .id. Because again, the default level of everything is public in the D language for classes or for structs, which again is going to be a little bit different than in other languages like C++. Just to show you a little preview of classes here, let's go ahead and just show here very briefly here. That I need to define a constructor here. And D always gives helpful error messages. Let's go ahead and do something like this here. Name equals name, just so we have a constructor. And let's see, it's expecting 1 argument, not 2, in our constructor. Let's go ahead and just pass in an ID, int ID, something like that. Okay, just so we can see that this still works here. And basically what I'm just showing you here, again, if you're coming from a C++ background, let's say, that I can still access this field here. Okay, it's public by default. Okay, so let me revert this back to a struct here so we can carry on with our example and fix this. Now, one way that we would imagine we could fix this is, again, by just setting things private here. Okay, so that we can't just access the individual field. So let's go ahead and try this out here. And wow, it actually looks like it works here, which is the proper behavior in the D programming language. Again, that's going to be something that's a little bit different to you. And again, part of that I think is motivated by the module system. Again, if we just go ahead and read the private attribute, symbols with private visibility can only be accessed from within the same module. So this file itself is a module here. We can label them as modules in the files here. But that's the basic idea here, okay? So even making this private here, I can still access it. So how do I fix this? How do I make this appropriate so that, for instance, I cannot access ID here? Well, the easiest thing for me to do here is to actually create a new file here. So let's go ahead and split this up here. And I'm going to go ahead and move this just a little bit here. And I'm just going to go ahead and create a file. I'm going to make it student here. And let's just go ahead and move this struct over here. Okay. Now, typically what we'll want to do here is the first line of our program, create something like the module here. This will be the default anyways, based off the file name, but let's just go ahead and we will want to eventually get in the habit here. We'll talk about this later on when we move to maybe some larger projects here. And I'm going to go ahead and just try to run this just to, again, show you, since this is our first time working with multiple files, what types of errors we're going to get here. So first and foremost, let me go ahead and try to run this here. Oops, I've got to make sure I save everything. And the first thing is I'm going to get an error here in my file here because it doesn't know about student here, right? I'm only passing in main.d. So what if I try to type in or add student.d here? Okay, let's go ahead and try that. Still undefined. Well, we've created this module here. So let's go ahead and try to import that. Import student. Okay, and that'll actually give me access to this structure here. So it's sort of like, again, for folks coming from Java or Python, this will be very familiar. From C++, it's sort of like an include statement, although in D, things are modules. So let's go ahead and try this. Now we're getting a little bit closer here. It looks like it found our struct here, but in fact, private's doing the right thing. It's saying no property ID for S, which is of type student here, where we can access this field here. So we're appropriately hiding that field here. Successfully, our visibility attribute is working. So let's go ahead and make this public now, just so we can see that things are working. And now it works. Okay, everything is visible. Now, again, I was more sensitive about this ID field. So the other thing that we can do in the deprogramming language is just go ahead and make this individual field private here. Okay. And that will successfully block out this line here. So we can actually still do, for instance, s.name equals, I don't know, Joe, just another generic name here. And if I do this in my code and comment out ID and run and compile it, again, name is visible by default. It's public, even if I don't specify that. And the private, we would not be able to access ID here. Okay, so that's the idea here. And again, these, if I just put public here with a colon, everything that follows will be public. If I put private, everything that follows will be private. So again, if you have a long list of things, folks tend to do that. Stylistically, sometimes folks will prefer this style here, or actually annotating everything individually. Okay, just depends on your goals here. Okay, so this works here. Now, again, as I mentioned, this is going to be a little bit of a teaser for when we talk about modules and some stuff. That'll have to be on a dedicated video, but we could actually do this at a module level here. Let's go ahead and make our student public here. And if I run it, it works just fine. But maybe I have some internals here that I don't want to expose here. So let's make this private. And now we can see that we've successfully hidden everything that follows after here. Or we can otherwise, let's go ahead and just mark this struct itself as private. And it'll say undefined identifier. Or we can make it public as such, either way. So the deprogramming language gives us a lot of different ways to control how we encapsulate our data. And later on in this series, we'll talk about modules, how things get packaged up. We'll eventually do more of a dive into compiling, linking, these sort of things, so we understand them when we're building libraries and ultimately building usable and interesting software. But for now, at the very least, you know about public, private, and protected, that they exist in the deprogramming language. We've looked at a use case of private versus public, and again, some of the differences in the deprogramming language versus things you might be used to in C++ or Java, for instance. So with that said, folks, I hope this lesson helped you out here and you're enjoying this series on the deprogramming language. And well, there's still much more to learn. So make sure that you go ahead and look out for the next video. If you have questions about this, make sure to engage in the discussion. And I'll look forward to otherwise seeing you in the next one.